Chapter 1. December 1811. Mr. Aaron Gardiner reined in his bay horse and leaned forward, relishing the warmth emanating from its great body. It was a December day in Hertfordshire, England, and after decades in India, he was not used to such cold. His eyes roved slowly over the small town of Meriton. It was a pleasant scene, though a common enough one, with the white-clapped church and the little shops, the cobbled streets, wending their leisurely way between the timber-framed houses, and the village square shimmering with frost, presided over by graceful oak trees. There was nothing about Meriton itself to explain the rush of emotion in his heart, except that he had been born and raised here, and he had been gone for more than 20 years. "Are you well, brother?" Aaron smiled at his younger brother, Edward. "I am well enough. Meriton has not changed much in the last decade." "No," Edward agreed fondly, "though that is, I believe, part of its charm. Are you cold?" Aaron chuckled and gently spurred his horse forward. "I am. The climate of India has thinned my blood. Longbourn is not much farther, I recall." "A mile out of Meriton, yes. We should be there within the half-hour." "Very well. We are close enough to our destination that I should practice the names of the family again. Our sister Frances was fortunate to win the favour of Mr. James Bennet, Master of Longbourn, correct?" "Yes," Edward concurred. "They have 5 daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Lydia, and Catherine, though she is always called Kitty. She is the 4th daughter, and Lydia the 5th. "You have told me that our sister Fanny is not particularly sensible," Aaron stated. Edward Gardiner heaved a deep, soulful sigh and said, "She is not. I know it has been decades since you have seen her, but in her youth she was a tremendous beauty. I have no doubt that is what attracted Bennet to her, but they are not well matched." "Because he is a gentleman and she is the daughter of a mere attorney?" Aaron demanded coldly. "Of course not," Edward protested. "You know that my dear wife herself is the granddaughter of a gentleman. No, they are not well suited because Bennet is extremely intelligent and Fanny is, regrettably, of a weak mind and illiberal understanding." Aaron glanced at his brother contritely and said, "I'm sorry." "Not at all. I fully understand that, given your difficult experiences with Viscount Grayson, you are sensitive to the pain of regrettable class distinctions." "I am indeed. But let us continue. Longbourn is entailed away from our nieces." "Yes, and our sister's portion, while respectable enough, is not sufficient to supply the needs of 6 women if Bennet should die before his time. Fanny therefore spends most of her time worrying about her daughter's prospects, which makes her a challenging companion. Sadly, Mr. Bennet chooses to hide in his library instead of taking her in hand, leaving the burden of her emotional outbursts to the eldest 2 Bennet girls, Jane and Elizabeth." "I do not believe you have described the appearances and personalities of our nieces in detail," Aaron said. "Jane is a stunning beauty, much like Fanny was in her youth," Edward said fondly, "but our oldest niece combines beauty with a gentle and loving personality." "And yet she is not married?" Aaron asked. "She is not. There is a dearth of eligible young men in the area due to the war, and she has very little in the way of a dowry. The marriage settlements provide a £5,000 portion for Fanny, but that does not go far with 5 daughters and the loss of the estate to the male heir, a clergyman by the name of Collins, when Bennet dies." "What is the Longbourn income?" "It is about £2,000 a year." Aaron Gardiner lifted an eyebrow and said, "That is a very reasonable sum. Surely Bennet has saved through the years for the care of his wife and daughters in the event of his death." Edward's mouth formed a grim line, and he said, "Regrettably, he has not, Aaron. Fanny loves to spend money, and in the beginning they naturally assumed they would birth a son to inherit. When they finally realised that the estate would be lost to Collins, they were both too set in their ways. Bennet has kept them out of debt, but nothing more. It is a difficult situation. Of course, Mrs. Gardiner and I will assist to some degree if necessary, but we have 4 children and may have more. And you have 4 children of your own who are your responsibility, and you will need your savings to launch them into society. Aaron nodded at this, but kept his own counsel. He was in a position to help his nieces a great deal more than his brother, but he was not certain he was willing to do so. He was a brother and an uncle, but he was also a father and a businessman, and he would not throw money away foolishly. "And what of the other girls?" he inquired. Edward chuckled and declared, "They have a truly disparate range of personalities. Elizabeth is second to Jane in birth and beauty. Unlike Jane, who is serene and gentle, Elizabeth is extremely intelligent and has a satirical wit, much like her father. She is a delightful young woman, but not placid. Mary, the third, is the only daughter who did not inherit Fanny's looks. She attempts to make up for it by reading dull sermons and practicing the pianoforte at all hours. Kitty and Lydia are unfortunately foolish and gauche girls and are prone to chase after the officers of the militia regiment currently stationed in Meriton. Fanny does not see anything wrong with their poor behaviour, and Bennet is too lazy to rein in their crass conduct. I regret being so negative, but I thought you should understand the situation as it is." Aaron nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate it, brother, and I believe Longbourn is now in view." The mansion appeared, and his mount sped up slightly, apparently sensing that the warmth of the stable and a bucket of oats were near. It was a pleasant building, not ostentatious, but its grounds and stables were well kept up. Edward turned toward his brother and asked, "Are you ready to meet your sister after more than 20 years, Aaron?" Aaron Gardiner nodded, his mind slipping back more than 2 decades to the last time he had been in his family home in Meriton. "Yes, Edward, I am." Meriton, September 1785. "You will have to leave, Aaron." Aaron Gardiner stared blankly at his father, who was seated behind his simple wooden desk in his study, his wrinkled face downcast. "Leave, sir," he repeated in a hollow tone. "Yes. I was visited by Viscount Grayson today. He is incandescent with rage over your, as he termed it, seduction of Miss Sophia." Aaron's skin flushed red in outrage, and he exclaimed, "I did not seduce her. How dare he say such a thing? I honourably asked for her hand in marriage." Mr. Gardiner stood up and stepped around the desk, lowering his right hand onto his elder son's shoulder. "I know, my boy, I know. I truly have great sympathy for the passions of young love, but it was a foolish thing to do. You are the son of an attorney, and she is the daughter of a viscount. You should have known Grayson would never permit her to marry you." "I am a clergyman, sir. That is an honourable profession." "And Miss Sophia is the daughter of a member of the aristocracy. You reached too high, Aaron." "I did not reach," his son cried out passionately. "We fell in love. We have so much in common, father. Our shared love of music brought us together as I taught her on the pianoforte, but she also loves the Lord so deeply. She seeks to honour him in a way that is quite foreign to the rest of the family. It is not as if Lord Grayson cares for her. She is the youngest and the plainest. Her mother is dead, and he is too busy with his wine, and... Well, I will not speak of it, but he is not a good father to any of his daughters, but especially to Sophia." "Be that as it may, I must concern myself with my own daughters," the elder Gardiner stated sadly. "Grayson has threatened to ruin their chances of good marriages if you do not depart the locale immediately. And believe me, he could do it, Aaron. He could, and he would." "I am serving as curate under the rector at Enford, sir, and have been promised the living when he retires, which will be very soon as his health is failing. Miss Sophia will soon be of an age to marry without her father's consent, so—"
"Aaron,"
his father interrupted, his chest heaving.
"You know the power of Lord Grayson. My position as solicitor depends on the goodwill of the Viscount and his cronies. I cannot afford to have him as my enemy, son. I am sorry, but you will have to leave Enford. Indeed, you must leave Hertfordshire."
His son gulped, his eyes wet. "For how long, sir?" The grey-headed solicitor shook his head.
"I do not know, Aaron. I have £2,000 available, and I will give you that money to allow you to get a good start wherever you settle, but it must be far away."
"I cannot take that, father. What of my sisters?"
"I have money set aside for the girls and Edward. Do not concern yourself with them. Take care of yourself, Aaron. Please know that I love you dearly and wish that there was another way."
Tears filled the eyes of both father and son, and they embraced one another. It was the last time that Aaron Gardiner ever saw his father. Chapter 2. Longbourn. Aaron peered with interest at the mansion of Longbourn as his horse followed his brother Edward's steed down the long main drive which led to the stables. His eyes wandered thoughtfully over the house, taking in the well-maintained red brick and the neat ivy climbing on it. Many of the several chimneys, including the servants' quarters, were trickling smoke into the thin, clear air. Apparently, the Bennets were not parsimonious with their wood. Behind the house, the stables themselves were equally impressive, modern and sturdy, with a plethora of grooms and boys milling about in the yard and visible through the warmly glowing windows. A tall man stepped forward out of the throng, touching his forelock.
"Mr. Gardiner,"
he said respectfully. "Jackson," Edward greeted in return, dismounting and handing his horse off to the man before turning towards his brother. "Jackson, the stable master," he introduced. "Jackson, this is my brother, Aaron Gardiner." The stable master saluted again and took Aaron's horse as well.
"I'll take care of him, sir,"
he promised, eyeing the gelding keenly.
"We've combs and water and mash aplenty."
Aaron inclined his head and moved with Edward to the house. The two brothers entered the mansion through the front door, where the butler greeted Edward Gardiner with obvious approval, and Aaron, once his name was mentioned, with a flicker of surprise. The butler guided the men down a corridor, opened the door to the drawing-room, stepped within, and announced, "Mr. Edward Gardiner, Mr. Aaron Gardiner." Aaron followed his brother inside and cast an expert eye around the chamber, which was lavishly inhabited by furniture, much of it in the Meriton style. A moment later, his gaze shifted to the oldest of the three ladies seated on the couches near the crackling fire, and, to his surprise, he found his throat clogged with emotion. When he had left England's shores so many years ago, his sister Frances had been but 15 years of age. Now she was a middle-aged matron, the mother of 5 nearly grown daughters. But in that moment he could see the little sister who had followed him around like a puppy when he was not yet out of his teens. "Aaron!" Mrs. Bennet cried out, leaping to her feet, her blue eyes flared wide with incredulity. It cannot be! Is it truly you?" "It is," he rasped through the tightness in his throat. "Oh, Fanny, it has been so long." Elizabeth Bennet had been enjoyably employed in reading a book from the circulating library when the door opened, and her favourite uncle, Edward Gardiner, stepped into the room with an unknown man at his heels. Within a minute, the man was no longer unknown. He was, in fact, a long-lost uncle who had migrated to the ends of the earth decades previously. "Oh, Aaron! Aaron!" Mrs. Bennet shrieked.
Jane! Jane, I need my smelling salts! To think of seeing you again! Oh, Aaron, where have you been all these years?
Not surprisingly, the shrieking of the lady of the manor brought not just Mrs. Bennet's personal maid, but the lady's husband and 3 younger daughters as well. In the midst of the explanations and introductions, Elizabeth inspected her newly arrived uncle. The elder Mr. Gardiner was of average height and rather thin, with blue eyes like her mother and dark hair like her other Uncle Gardiner. His skin was darker than her own, no doubt due to exposure to the sun during his time of exile, which, she now discovered, had been in India. His expression was friendly, his manners easygoing and pleasant, and his speech of interest. She quite thought she would like her newfound uncle. A few hours later.
"Are you quite certain you do not wish for me to come along, Aaron?" Mrs. Bennet asked worriedly. "Emma will be quite shocked, and perhaps if I were along it would be easier for her."
"I would like to see Emma as quickly as possible," Aaron said with a smile, "and I know you need to prepare for the arrival of Edward's family on the morrow. Do not be concerned, sister."
"Oh, very well," Mrs. Bennet said. "Now mind you, we keep country hours, and I depend on your returning in good time for dinner."
"We will, Mamma," Elizabeth assured the lady of the house. Kitty and Lydia erupted into the vestibule at this juncture, and Kitty cried out,
"Mamma, tell Lydia to give me back my pink rosettes. They are mine, not hers." "I want them for my new hat, which I will wear with my new gown," Lydia exclaimed. "You have not used them, after all." "They are mine," Kitty shrieked. "It is not fair."
"Lydia," Jane said gently, "I have some yellow rosettes in my room that I would be glad to give you for your hat. Would they not look far better than pink, given that your dress is green? What do you think, Mamma?"
"Oh, yes, Lydia, yes. Pink rosettes would not match that green. It would look dreadful."
In the midst of this discussion of dresses and millinery, Elizabeth, Mary, and Aaron Gardiner donned their outerwear, hurried out the front door, and climbed aboard the Bennet carriage. Aaron could see that both Elizabeth and Mary were embarrassed by the scene he had just witnessed, which was no surprise. As Edward had warned, Lydia and Kitty were both rambunctious and ill-behaved, and Lydia in particular was selfish and greedy. However, there was nothing his nieces could do about that, so he made a point of introducing a neutral topic as the carriage turned onto the road that would lead to Meriton. "I confess that it is surprising how little the countryside has changed since I last was here," he said, gazing out the window. "I fear it is not the most beautiful time of year," Elizabeth replied. "I prefer the other seasons more." "I like winter," Mary said, rather unexpectedly. "I like being indoors and enjoying warm fires and not being required to go out in company quite so often. I even like when we have snowstorms. It is so delightful outside." "I was very much like you when I was younger, Elizabeth," Aaron said, and then smiled at Mary. "But now, after decades in India, I find myself thoroughly in awe of chilly air, snowflakes, and ice." "Oh, Uncle, please do tell us about your time in India," Elizabeth requested. "I have read a little about tropical lands, but that is not quite the same as hearing from someone who has actually lived in such an exotic locale." Aaron responded with a few stories about life in India, though he largely confined himself to descriptions of the flora, fauna, and geography. His family situation was complex, and he was not yet ready to share all with his relations. Before he knew it, the carriage had come to a halt in front of a wooden house where his sister Emma and her husband now lived. He found himself tearing up again as he descended to the ground and walked up to the steps. His welcome by Emma was similar to that of Fanny, except that Emma did not call for smelling salts, though she was obviously overjoyed to see him again for the first time in decades.
"Oh, Aaron, I had forgotten about your unfortunate experience with Daisy," Emma Phillips exclaimed, her plain face alight with joy. "You were very fortunate not to break a leg."
It was my fault, not hers, Erin said with a grin. I was a fool to mount a young spirited horse like her. Father was rightfully angry at me. Elizabeth, who had thoroughly enjoyed listening to stories of the Gardiner siblings' childhood, was reluctant to interrupt, but the time was growing late. We will need to leave soon, Uncle Gardiner, so that we are home in time for dinner. Of course, Elizabeth. Emma, it was wonderful seeing you again. Give my respects to your husband, and I trust we will see one another soon. Oh, yes, Arthur will be overjoyed to hear of your return to England's shores. I am certain we will visit Longbourn soon, and we can speak more of the past. Erin nodded, smiled, kissed his sister, and then accompanied his nieces out of the door. He found it interesting that Emma, who had married a solicitor instead of a gentleman, seemed more content than Fanny, whose husband was far wealthier. Uncle, Mary asked shyly once they descended the stairs which led to the street where the Bennet carriage was waiting. Yes? Would you be willing to stop for a few minutes at the bookstore? The proprietor sells music scores as well, and I have one waiting for me. Of course, Aaron replied enthusiastically, though your mother did warn us not to be overly late for dinner. We can stop for 10 minutes, Elizabeth said after consulting her watch. No more. A smile transformed Mary's usually serious face. I do not think that I am the one that needs that reminder, Lizzie. Elizabeth laughed and admitted, I am very fond of the library and bookstore, Uncle, and often have to be dragged out by my sisters. I have a taste for good books as well, Erin said warmly, and gave the coachman the requisite orders, whereupon he handed his nieces into the vehicle and followed them within. 2 minutes later, the carriage came to a gentle halt. Uncle and nieces descended into the chilly afternoon air and made their way hastily into a building which served as both bookstore and circulating library. Erin opened the door for the girls, waited for them to enter, followed them inside, and then halted in delight. The room was both airy and cozy, with books lining the walls on honey-coloured wooden shelves. A fire roared within a generous fireplace, and sunlight poured through expansive windows to splash along the green carpet. Elizabeth barely waited to return the greeting of Mr. Wells, the proprietor, before heading purposefully for the circulating library at one end. As Mary moved to the desk to speak with Mr. Wells, Erin made his way to a rack of musical scores. Erin inspected the sheet music with pleasure, impressed with the range and scope of music available for those with sufficient funds. It was both surprising and enjoyable to observe such a variety here in a shop in a small village. Do your daughters play, Uncle? Inquired a timid voice from his right. Erin turned and smiled down at Mary, who was clutching a piece of sheet music in one gloved hand. No, but my eldest son, Philip, enjoys playing very much. He was not surprised at the look of amazement in his niece's eyes, as here in England it was not common for a gentleman to devote himself to learning to play instruments. That was considered more the purview of the ladies. Oh, how interesting, Mary finally managed. Does my cousin play well? Aaron Gardiner glanced out the window toward the west, where the sun was now glowing pink and orange a little above the horizon. Yes, he said. Philip plays very well indeed. The Hursts' home, London. Miss Darcy, Mr. Darcy, Charles, Caroline Bingley gushed. Oh, how wonderful to see you all on this chilly evening. Please do come into the drawing-room to warm yourself by the fire. Darcy nodded, and with his sister's arm in his own, followed Caroline Bingley down the hall and into the drawing-room of the house, where his hosts, Frederick and Louisa Hurst, were waiting. Darcy looked around as they passed through the door. A blazing fire highlighted the dinginess of the room rather than disguising it. The curtains were faded and hung limply above worn rugs laid across an unpolished floor and furniture that had seen better days. A gust of wind blustered around the eaves and set a window rattling. In contrast to the unprepossessing setting, both Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst glimmered in their finery, decked out in frills and furbelows and fine fabrics. Darcy knew from experience that the dinner itself would be equally fine. Mr. Hurst employed a cook of surpassing skill and expense. In Darcy's opinion, the money that sank into plumes and jewels and silks and puddings and exotic glazes on meats would be better put towards maintaining the house. "Miss Darcy, Mr. Darcy," said Mrs. Hurst, rising to her feet and curtsying. "It is good to see you both." Darcy bowed, and Georgiana curtsied, and the ladies took their places on several uncomfortable-looking chairs near the fire, where Caroline picked up her needlework and began working on it again, while Louisa Hurst seemed content to stare into the flames. "Brandy, Darcy? Bingley?" Hurst asked, rising to his feet and shambling over to a decanter on a nearby side table. "Thank you, yes," Darcy said, and Bingley murmured his own agreement. "Miss Darcy," Miss Bingley said, her lips parted to show her gleaming white teeth, "pray believe me when I say that I am in raptures with your design of the table. It is infinitely superior to that of Miss Grantley's." "Thank you, Miss Bingley," Georgiana answered softly. "Your needlework is lovely." "Oh, that is too kind, Miss Darcy. Yes, I do flatter myself that I'm quite adept, but then so are you. Indeed, you are the most accomplished young lady of my acquaintance." Georgiana blushed at these words and cast an uneasy look at her brother, who smiled at her reassuringly. Miss Bingley was, as usual, overly flattering of the girl, but Georgiana would need to become accustomed to such ingratiating remarks. In a few short years, the only daughter of Pemberley would enter society, and given Georgiana's accomplishments, her connections, and her substantial dowry, she would be the target of numerous compliments from impecunious gentlemen in search of a rich wife, along with their eager mothers and sisters. "Do you intend to stay in London for the season, Miss Darcy?" Caroline asked, her fingers working busily. "Or will you perhaps be returning to Pemberley?" "That depends on what my brother wishes," Miss Darcy said. "I confess that I long for Pemberley, though town has its pleasures and amusements too." "Indeed, Pemberley is utterly marvellous," Miss Bingley exclaimed. "I do hope that Charles will find an estate in Derbyshire like Pemberley." Georgiana frowned and said innocently, "I understood that Mr. Bingley had leased an estate in Hertfordshire, Miss Bingley. Was it a disappointment to you?" Caroline's lips thinned at these words, and she raised her eyes heavenward and said, "The house and lands were well enough, I suppose, but the society— oh, it was quite dreadful, Miss Darcy. Vulgar matrons and gauche girls who chased officers. The so-called gentry were country bumpkins. I was never so happy as when we returned to town." Fitzwilliam Darcy, who had been sipping his brandy, happened to glance at his friend Bingley at this juncture, and his heart twisted within him. Bingley was staring at the floor, his lips set in a thin line with a deep cleft between his eyebrows. His poor friend had fallen in love with a blonde goddess, Miss Jane Bennet, while in Hertfordshire, and, based on his demeanour, had not yet entirely recovered. Darcy, too, had been strangely affected by Miss Bennet's next youngest sister, an enticing, tantalizing young lady by the name of Elizabeth. The two eldest, Mrs. Bennet, while intelligent, handsome, and well-mannered, were burdened with a vulgar mother with ties to trade, and two younger sisters who continually behaved in a reckless, audacious, and insolent way. Miss Elizabeth was not remotely worthy of the hand of a Darcy, and the object of Bingley's affections, Miss Bennet, was not truly in love with his friend. Since the Bennet estate of Longbourn was entailed to a distant relation, all the Bennet daughters were seeking a wealthy husband. "As for Miss Eliza Bennet," Caroline Bingley brayed, her loud voice penetrating his consciousness, "well, Miss Darcy, you would be quite horrified. When her elder sister fell ill and was required to stay at Netherfield, nothing would do for Miss Elizabeth but to march 3 miles across muddy fields entirely unaccompanied. It showed a most abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country-town indifference to decorum. Darcy's breath hitched, as his mind, quite contrary to reason, immediately formed an image of Miss Elizabeth, her beautiful eyes brightened by exercise, her luscious chestnut curls twisted and tumbled from her march across fields and over stiles to Netherfield, where the girl had shown devoted, tender care to her sister, who was indeed unwell. Darcy was very thankful that they had left Hertfordshire, away from the magnetic pull of Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Chapter 3. Longbourn, December 1811. A full moon shone proudly in a frosted sky, beaming down on Longbourn and spattering ivy shadows across brick washed in silver. Golden light beamed in counterpoint from the windows into the yard. Inside, warm and cosy, a small crowd milled about. Firelight and candlelight glanced brightly off of several cheerful red coats, as well as a polished table groaning under the weight of a bounty of tea and coffee, cakes and sweetmeats. Aaron Gardiner sat on a chair in the east sitting-room, while his brother Edward and his wife Madeline took their places on a small couch nearby. Madeline, along with their 4 children, had arrived at Longbourn 2 days previously. The children were in the nursery, being cared for and entertained by Jane and 2 nursemaids, and Edward and Madeline were sitting together, murmuring softly to one another, obviously enjoying the time together after a brief separation. It made Aaron miss his dear wife Sophia very much, and he looked forward to the day when the ship carrying her and their 3 younger children finally finished its long voyage from India to London. 3 of their nieces were present in the room with their friend, Miss Maria Lucas, and a number of militia officers, all resplendent in their red coats and white breeches. Lydia, Kitty, and Maria focused exclusively on the young gentleman, but Elizabeth, whose manners were better than those of her sisters, was careful to keep her own relations in the conversation. "Is it pleasant to experience an English Christmas, Uncle?" Elizabeth asked. "Christmas must have been a very different experience in India." "India has an exceedingly hot climate," Aaron agreed. "I find myself both relishing the cold of a Hertfordshire December along with shivering uncontrollably at times. As I told your other Uncle Gardiner, my blood has thinned after many years in the tropics." "I have found this winter here in Hertfordshire to be exceptionally pleasant," Lieutenant Wickham said, with an admiring glance at Elizabeth. "Though I confess that during the Christmas season my heart pines away for the colder climes of Derbyshire. Alas, I can never return to my home, so I must be content to stay here. Indeed, with the blessing of such fine society, I find I cannot repine much." "Poor Mr. Wickham," Lydia cried sympathetically. "That horrible Mr. Darcy has treated you so cruelly. If I were you, I would challenge him to a duel over his lack of honour." Wickham struck a dramatic pose as he protested, "Not at all, Miss Lydia, not at all. Regardless of the fact that Mr. Darcy has done me great wrong, I could never strike against him in such a way, as it would taint the memory of his beloved sire, who is my own godfather." "My apologies, Lieutenant Wickham," Aaron Gardiner commented, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "I am unaware of the details of your struggles. Perhaps you would be willing to explain the situation to me." George Wickham did so with great enthusiasm. He had his story well rehearsed of how the elder Mr. Darcy had loved George, the son of his steward, and had paid for his education at Cambridge and provided for his godson in his will by awarding Wickham a valuable living in the church. Of how the younger Mr. Darcy, filled with jealousy and cruelty towards his father's godson, had denied Wickham the Kimpton living, which was his by right and honour. Of how Wickham now struggled to keep body and soul together, though always with nobility and grace. Elizabeth, Lydia, Kitty, and Maria Lucas all wore looks of outrage, sympathy, or both, but Aaron merely lifted a curious eyebrow and asked, "Did you attend Cambridge or Oxford, Lieutenant?" "Cambridge, sir," the other man replied, his lips tightening. This older man, with his penetrating brown eyes, unfashionable clothing, and tanned and roughened skin, was not like the traditional men of Wickham's acquaintance, and thus was difficult to read. "And when did you take orders, Mr. Wickham?" The militiaman cleared his throat and said, "Well, as to that, when Darcy refused me the living, it seemed pointless to be ordained." Gardiner frowned, even as he shot a gaze at Miss Elizabeth, who now wore a puzzled crease between her eyebrows. "I do not understand, Mr. Wickham. This Mr. Darcy could hardly award you the living if you were not ordained, nor is ordination the work of the moment, as you would have been required to spend a year as a deacon under an established rector. Surely it was not reasonable that your patron's son allow the living to remain unfilled for a year or more. That would not be a responsible act on his part." Wickham gulped and shot a nervous glance at Elizabeth, whose face was now blank, her eyes wary. "Sadly, after I graduated from Cambridge, I had very little to live on, and therefore it was impossible for me to make time for ordination, Mr. Gardiner," he declared. "If Darcy had provided me the support I needed, I would have been ordained and settled in Kympton." "And what have you been doing since you left Cambridge?" Aaron asked. Wickham took a deep breath and forced a smile. "Many things, Mr. Gardiner. I fear, however, that the night grows late. I must depart, as I would not wish to displease my commander." "By all means, Mr. Wickham," Gardiner replied sarcastically. "It would be most unwise for you to enrage a man who holds power over your life and well-being." Wickham flinched at these words, but turned his practised smile and bow towards the coterie of women gazing at him. All but Elizabeth blushed and curtsied, and he departed, feeling confident that he had not lost their esteem. "You were rude to poor Mr. Wickham," Lydia cried indignantly, once the handsome lieutenant had left the parlour. Gardiner leaned back and took a sip of tea before saying, "I dislike liars, Miss Lydia, and I dislike slanderers even more." "You think he was lying, uncle?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Certainly. The story of the denied living is absurd. If the living were truly destined for Mr. Wickham, his patron's son would have legally been unable to deny Wickham his due." "He told me before," Elizabeth said slowly, casting her mind back to her first discussion with Wickham on the matter, "that there was an informality to the bequest." "Utter nonsense, my dear niece," Gardiner said firmly. "My own stepson is currently embroiled in complex legal matters concerning a legacy. I assure you that many in his extended family are unhappy with his inheritance, but the law is on his side. Furthermore, if Mr. Wickham did not wish to defame his godfather's name, why is the younger Mr. Darcy's supposed perfidy known far and wide? I know Mr. Wickham's type, and give no quarter to such men. He was blessed with a valuable education, good looks, and a charming personality. Even if this Darcy has done him wrong, and I doubt he has, Mr. Wickham has advantages far greater than many a steward's son. He is in his late 20s, and apparently has done nothing substantial with his life. I am the son of a mere solicitor myself, and when my life situation grew difficult, I worked hard to better it." "You have always been extraordinarily hard-working, ambitious, and committed, brother," Edward Gardiner said, entering the conversation. "I suppose that is true," Aaron agreed, rising to his feet. "Perhaps I was a little harsh in my assessment of Mr. Wickham's lack of accomplishments, but regarding the living, I'm quite certain he is being deceptive." "Well, I believe he's wonderful," Lydia declared pettishly, jumping to her feet. "Mr. Darcy is rude and proud, and he insulted Lizzie. Mr. Wickham is generous and handsome and charming. I think you were terribly cruel to him." She flounced out of the parlour in search of delicacies to eat, and Kitty and Maria followed her, leaving Elizabeth with her two uncles and aunt. "Thank you, uncle," Elizabeth murmured. "You have given me much to think of." "I'm glad, my dear," the older man said quietly. "I have not known you long, but you obviously have a charitable heart. That is all to the good. But it would be regrettable if you were to blindly support a man who is not worthy of your compassion and friendship. There are those who are worth sacrificing for, and those who are not." Elizabeth considered this for a full minute, and then nodded ruefully. "Mr. Darcy insulted me the very day we first laid eyes on one another," she mused. "And I fear that I allowed my outrage to taint my view of the gentleman. I do believe Mr. Darcy to be above his company, but perhaps he is not the villain I thought him to be." "Or perhaps he is," Aaron returned cynically, his mind slipping back 20 years. It is possible that both Mr. Darcy and Mr. Wickham are at fault in this matter. I have known nobles and commoners alike to treat others with cruelty, unfortunately. Rockhill, the Earl of Chartham's estate, Kent, March 1790. Rockhill was an expansive estate, vast, lush acres sprawling about the elaborate manse, dotted with tumble-down cottages and flocks of white sheep. Some ways away from the ornate main house, on the other side of a copse of trees, a ramshackle lodge huddled. Storms were a dread to its inhabitants, causing alarming creaks throughout and water dripping miserably through a roof in disrepair. "The baby is awake, Mrs. Hamilton." "Thank you, Polly," Mrs. Sophia Hamilton said wearily. "I will go and fetch her." "No, you wait and I'll fetch the little one," Polly replied firmly. Her employer nodded in relief and leaned back against her chair, releasing a deep sigh of exhaustion. The baby was still up at least once a night, and even when both her children slept, she was often kept awake by worry. Polly, her maid of all work, walked into the room carrying baby Rebecca Hamilton in her arms. Sophia took the little one into her arms and began nursing her. 20 minutes later, the child was replete with milk, and Sophia stood up to change her nappy. There was a knock, and Polly rushed to the door as Sophia took a deep breath and straightened her back. She received very few visitors, as she was still in mourning for her husband, dead these 5 months. Those visitors she did receive were often less than pleasant. "Mr. Aaron Gardiner," Polly announced, her face alight with excitement. Shock caused her to tighten her grip on her baby, even as she swayed slightly in disbelief. "Sophia, Mrs. Hamilton," Mr. Gardiner began as he rushed forward. "Sit down, please. I should not have startled you so." "Aaron," she murmured, her overly thin face pale with wonder. "Is it truly you?" "It is, my dear," he answered softly, casting a meaningful glance at Polly. The woman smiled and curtsied before retreating out the door, leaving them alone. "I am so sorry, Aaron. So very sorry," Sophia whispered, sinking into her chair. "It was not your fault," the man replied sternly. "None of it was your fault. Your father threatened mine and I was sent away. You did nothing wrong." "My father," Sophia repeated, her eyes distant. "I believe I hate him, Aaron." "Hush, Sophia. We are star-crossed lovers, like Romeo and Juliet, except that we are, by the grace of God, still alive. I came here as soon as I heard about Mr. Hamilton's death. I'm sorry about the loss of your husband. Or perhaps I'm not. How did he treat you, my dear?" Mrs. Hamilton leaned back against her chair and said, "We usually lived apart since Peter was in the army. What time we spent together was not unpleasant. We were not close. Indeed, we had nothing in common, but he was a kind husband. Peter was the best of the Earl of Chartham's sons, by far." "You have 2 children, I understand." "Yes, Rebecca is but 4 months old, and Philip is not yet 3 years of age. Philip is currently the 5th in the line of succession for the earldom, which is why the old earl insists on taking him away." "Taking him away?" Gardiner demanded in alarm. "Yes, we are currently relegated to this hunting lodge because I have not yet submitted to his directive that Philip be raised with his other grandson, the son of William, the earl's eldest. If Chartham was a better man, I would not hesitate so much, but he is an ungodly, vindictive, licentious, haughty individual. I will not allow my son to be raised under his direction and control." She stood up and began pacing the room, clutching her baby daughter to her chest. "There is very little money left from my dowry, as my husband was not skilled at managing our finances. I do not know how we will live, Aaron, I do not." Aaron stepped in her path, and she looked up, startled. "Marry me, Sophia." For a moment, she felt dawning hope, and then her face fell. "We cannot. I am of age now, but the Earl will interfere if the banns are called." "I have a common license in my pocket," Aaron replied tenderly. "There is a clergyman nearby who is a friend from Cambridge, an old confidant of mine. We can proceed to his church this very morning and be secretly married by noon and on our way shortly afterwards. I know Polly has been with you for a long time, and I'm certain she will come with us to help with the children. I promise you that the Earl will never find you or your babies." Now hope was surging, but she shook her head and said, "Where would we go? Surely it is not safe to return to Hertfordshire. Your father is no doubt still fearful of the influence of mine." "Can you trust me to take you to India, Sophia? I've spent the last years in India making my fortune. I promise you that your children will be mine, and I will do everything in my power to raise and love and protect and guide them." Worry and doubt gave way to relief and dawning happiness and tears of thankfulness. "Yes, yes, Aaron, yes,"